Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Diaspora History Podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
This is the Diaspora History Podcast, and we have today with us Hema from the Moreish Podcast. And before we start, I'll just have her introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hema. My family is Trinidadian. I was born and raised here in Toronto, and I have been working on the Moreish Podcast for 3 seasons now. It's been really exciting, really interesting, and a lot of work, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for that. That was really great. And I'm really excited to have you here on the podcast to, again, speak with another person that is actually talking about the Caribbean, because there's so few of us that are having this type of discussion. So my start for you is, what was your why behind starting the Moreish Podcast, and what inspired you to create this platform?
Yeah, that's a great question. The reason, my why, is, as I mentioned in my intro, I was born and raised in Toronto. My family's Trinidadian. My parents immigrated to Toronto shortly before I was born. And so my experience of growing up in Canada in a Trinidadian family, I had this sort of split life where back in the 70s, people were not afraid to call you names. Racism was rampant. There was a lot of things that I felt like I needed to hide outside of my home because I didn't like the way I felt when people were questioning or commenting or making me feel like I was other because of being Caribbean. And so growing up, I had this sort of double life. And as I got older and I really started to embrace more of my history and my heritage, it became evident to me that people didn't really understand the people of the Caribbean and who we are and the diversity. And what I mean by that is my family is of Indian origin. And I'd had a lot of questions. People would say to me, how can you be from the Caribbean, but you're not Black? Or how can you be from the Caribbean, but you're Indian? And people not really understanding the wide range of people who touched the different parts of the Caribbean and influenced. And I got so tired of answering all of these questions and trying to set the record straight. I wanted to share more of who we are. And when I say the Caribbean, I don't mean to say that we're all lumped in as one, but I do talk about the Caribbean as a whole on my podcast. I wanted to share as much information as I could to set the record straight, so to speak. But I also wanted to learn more about my heritage because, as I mentioned, growing up, I sort of felt like I had this split life of my outside Canadian self and my inside Trinidadian self, that I didn't learn as much of my heritage as I would have liked. And so now I'm also learning through this process of the podcast.
No, absolutely. I can definitely agree with you on that in terms of having kind of like a duality of yourself growing up. So, and for listeners who may be just discovering your work for the first time, how would you describe your podcast and the kind of stories you aim to tell?
My podcast the intention was to be rooted in culture and cuisine and food through the lens of history. Because, first of all, food is such a big part of Caribbean life, right? You don't go to somebody's house and not eat something, and you don't go to somebody's house and not bring something. And food is at every party, and it is such a core part of who we are certainly in my family, food is everywhere, but food holds so much history. And on the podcast, the reason I chose to talk about food and through the lens of history is it's such an accessible topic, right? If you talk about a specific dish, it is very easy for the average person, certainly in Canada, in North America, in other parts of the world, maybe, to understand food and then throw in a little bit of history. So I didn't want it to be super serious and just historical. I wanted the podcast to be as accessible to as many people and as listenable to as many people as possible. So I really talk about food and culture. And when I say culture, I mean things like festivals or sports and what is the history and why is cricket a big thing in the Caribbean and where does that come from?
Absolutely, because what you mentioned in terms of food, it's so part of our identity in terms of what we eat and the conversations that I know that I grew up hearing of people trying to decipher as to, "Oh, we call it this in our country and we you call it that." And just hearing that on a regular basis growing up was just unbelievable. And so Hema, for the name of your podcast is called the Moreish Podcast, which is very unique. Does it have a deeper meaning or is it just a play on words? And how does it connect your vision for the show?
The name of the podcast, so the word Moorish is something that I grew up with and I've known all my life. And interestingly, I've learned since then that it's not a word that everybody knows.
Mhm.
So when I had thought of the idea of the podcast and the direction I wanted to take it and really what I wanted to talk about, that first season, I had a co-host join me. And when I brought up the name Moorish, she understood what I meant. And her family is from different parts of the Caribbean than my family is. So I felt like it was something that people would understand. What it essentially is, Moorish, if you're eating something and it's delicious or it's snackable or craveable, you call it Moorish because you want more of it. And because I wanted to talk about food very specifically, to me it felt like it fit. I ask a lot of people a lot of guests who come on the podcast if they know what Moorish means. And interestingly, I would say about 25% say, yes, absolutely, I know what it means. Probably about 50% of people know the word Moorish when I give them some context. And then they say, oh, yes, absolutely, I know, but I wouldn't have put it together had you not told me. And then some people don't know it at all. And what I've recognized and what I've learned is it is a British word, which in Trinidad, we have a lot of British influence, which is makes sense that I know it, but also makes sense that people from other Caribbean islands or countries don't know it if they don't have that strong British influence.
Mhm. Absolutely, because the British Empire was quite large, and so for you, looking back at what you've done on the podcast, is there, would there be a specific episode that stands out as your favorite, and what made that conversation particularly meaningful or impactful to you?
Oh gosh, Wendy, that is such a big question. I don't have a favorite. I'll say that off the top. Season 1 was a very different podcast than subsequent seasons, and so season 2, season 3, I moved to a guest format. So have expert guests, historians, academics, cookbook authors, and each one brings unique information. They
Mhm.
bring a specific perspective, not only from their cultural background, but also their lived experience. Some people, for example, I have a couple of people who have no Caribbean background whatsoever, but have done extensive research as a historian or academic in the space. Every single conversation I have, there's at least one moment where I think, oh my gosh, that is an extraordinary piece of information that I didn't know before. But I can't say that there's a favorite
Mhm.
because they all have their value. They all bring fantastic information and a different perspective than I have, which just makes my knowledge and the knowledge that hopefully I'm sharing through the podcast more well-rounded for the listener.
I definitely would agree with you there. And, for your podcast journey, what has been some of, I guess, the challenges and what has been some of, I guess, the biggest hurdles you faced and how have you been able to navigate them?
We were talking a little bit just before we hit record, and there are a lot of challenges. For me, this is a labor of love.
Mm.
This is not something that I'm doing to bolster another part of my work. It is a standalone project and it's not monetized, which means that it is me. And as with your podcast, I'm sure I'm doing all of the research, I'm doing all of the outreach, the administration, the recording, the editing, the producing, writing, all of it. So, one of the biggest challenges is really just time and resources and the technical side of things. It took a lot to learn to
Mm.
learn how to be a podcaster. And it takes a lot of time and effort to pull it all together. Sometimes I listen back to some of my older episodes, or I listen to an episode that I'm editing, and the sound quality isn't the greatest, or the visual quality isn't the greatest. And I try to be, I try to give some grace to myself that I can't do all of it and I can't make it perfect. But sometimes I, sometimes that's a challenge for me as well, is I
Mhm.
spend so much time trying to perfect sound quality where that's not really my forte. I'm not a sound engineer.
Yeah.
And I have to just sit back and think, is the content still worth putting out? The answer has always been yes. I've
Yeah.
never not published an episode because of some technical challenges.
No, absolutely. And I guess the other thing is, do you feel as if you become more creative in this field of podcasting?
I don't know if creative is the word. I think I've become more knowledgeable and I have also become more flexible
Yeah.
in this journey because things happen, things change. It's not perfection. Again, it's just me. So I have to fit it in where I can fit it in. Creativity, I think sometimes, if
Mhm.
I'm honest, it sometimes is put aside because of all of the like actual technical parts of
Yeah.
podcasting. So I don't know if I've become more creative or it's more of a creative endeavor, but it's pushing my boundaries and my
Yes.
limits and my knowledge for sure.
Mhm. I could agree with you there. And, for you, what has being on this platform done for you personally and maybe professionally? Like, has hosting the podcast changed the way you see Caribbean culture or storytelling?
Oh, honestly, it's really been eye-opening. So, I will say, as I alluded to earlier, I didn't have a very strong understanding of my Caribbean or Trinidadian heritage for all of the reasons that I talked about earlier. So,
Mhm.
what that meant and what that means is I'm learning so much. And I recognize that my lived experience growing up here in Canada is very different than somebody's lived experience if they grew up in Trinidad or Jamaica or Barbados or whatever. I recognize and I understand that. And we each have a valuable perspective. But from a cultural perspective, it is opened my eyes to how similar we are, what our differences are, but how we have so many similarities and
Mhm.
connections together that even though the Caribbean isn't a monolith, I feel
Yeah.
like we are all kin. I feel like we can all relate to each other, even though our backgrounds might be from different parts of the world. The other
No.
thing Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just gonna say I was gonna agree with you there, that's for sure.
The other thing that I learned, Wendy, is the information that is out there in the books, in the papers, in literature is so strongly from one perspective.
Yes.
And when I look back on season 1, when we first started the podcast, we relied very heavily on literature and research that has been published. And because it is such a skewed perspective, it is from the perspective of the colonizers. It is not from the perspective of our people, from
Mm.
the Caribbean people, for the most part. It requires, from my perspective, from my belief, it requires a grain of salt, right? And to think about that, talk to other people, listen to the academics and the historians doing the research and doing the work now and reading what they're putting out, trying to pair both pieces together and make sense of what the true stories of our ancestors are.
Yeah, that is the challenge, right? When you're reading these papers and trying to digest what is being said and how it is being said as well. And so for you, I guess this leads into my next question in terms of, you've had the opportunity to speak with a range of guests. What is the one thing that really has stayed with you or kind of shifted your thinking?
You know, the people that I have spoken to, whether they are from the diaspora or not, whether they are still in the Caribbean or not, is the passion with which every single person who is doing this work, the research, writing a cookbook, the passion that they have for telling the true stories from their perspective, documenting and making sure that our history from our parents, our grandparents, our grandparents is not forgotten, and being able to parse through some of the artifacts and some of the documented history and add perspective to it. And if I can give an example, I did an episode with a woman based out of the US whose family is not from the Caribbean at all, but she, through going back to school, becoming an academic, meeting her mentor, decided that her thesis was going to be based in Jamaica. And so she went to Jamaica. She spent 5 years there studying and learning. And she talked about going to the libraries and digging out some of the archives and understanding that the archives say one thing and paint this really sort of rosy picture of the enslaved people. And if she had just looked at the archives and believed it, her understanding of life for an enslaved person would have been, oh, it was fine. They had a great life. But having to put it into perspective with what we actually know from people who heard the stories from their grandparents and who heard the stories from ancestors, putting the two together and understanding that what was written and what was documented was so skewed. I appreciate people being able to sort of do that work, right? Regardless of what their background is, spending 5 years in a country that you don't really know and getting to know the people and being accepted into the community so that you can tell these stories because she's interested in it, not because she wants to tell it from her perspective. That
Mhm.
to me, the passion that takes, the resilience that takes, the desire to actually tell real stories, that sticks out to me, and it shows through in every single guest.
Yeah.
They're not doing this with an ulterior motive except to tell the true stories.
Mhm. No, I would definitely agree with you there because it's not only just the passion, but there's a reverence there in terms of the material that they're looking at and want to be so accurate as to how this is being told. It is just next level when you are talking with them and having these discussions with them because you can see it, you can see it, you can feel it. It's the way that they interact with the material and the way that they want to be able to present the material because they always give it's kind of like they set up the scene and here is the justification and this is what happened. Not necessarily from their perspective, as you said, but they just want to tell the truth about that history.
Yeah, I talk to people and I've heard them say they recognize their own bias
Mm,
when doing the research, and recognizing their own biases helped them become a better researcher.
yeah.
Because if you recognize that, then you understand you have to put it aside and really pay attention to source material, and not only primary source material, but secondary sources
Mhm.
and conversations, and trying to put that all together. Oh my gosh,
Right.
it is so much work.
Exactly. Yeah, it is. And it is, and as well in this history as well within the Caribbean, it can be heavy. That's the other thing. People recognize the heaviness, the weight of this material, that this was a time frame period which did not show humanity in its best way at all, in any aspects, how you looked at it. But just to understand what that was, or at least to shed some light so there could be better understanding that I can say I can definitely, agree on in terms of how they present their work. Now, with your work, you often connect food, culture, and identity. How do you see storytelling as a tool for helping people to reconnect with their roots?
Yeah. As I talked about earlier, I chose food as sort of the crux of the conversation, and I don't only talk about food, right?
Mhm,
But it is such a easy topic, and it opens the doors to more listeners, I think.
mhm,
And food for us, depend regardless of which Caribbean country you come from, there is history in everything that we consume, in every food that we eat, every dish. There is history, and the history traces back to who was indigenous to the island, who were the enslaved people brought, who were the indentured, who were the colonizers. They all left a little bit of an imprint in not only the food, but in the culture.
mhm,
And I chose things like something like food or culture because I wanted to reach as many people as possible. I wanted to open those doors. And yeah, we're talking about history and we're talking about some really difficult topics. But if I can bring you in because I want you to be interested in the history of jerk chicken, and
mhm,
then you stay to listen to a story, or you stay to listen to a nugget of history, and then that's interesting enough for you to come back for another episode. The podcast has served its purpose in educating you in a way that it doesn't feel like it's academic.
mhm. No, absolutely, because I would agree with you in terms of that food is kind of like our first kind of like our memory archive that comes up because we don't connect what we're eating to say that means something or that connects into another place when it in truth and in fact it does. It really does connect us. That's why we season the way that we season. That's why things taste the way that they taste and they're paired a certain way. I mean, it's just, yes, it's different for, let's say, some Caribbean islands may be different, like, not everybody's gonna be drinking Mabi, but should have an idea of what Mabi is, as opposed to, let's say, sorrel, which is, for some I know in Mexico, they call it, Jamaica juice is what they call it, or hibiscus juice, it all has a connection, and that's, as I said, is part of our first memory archive.
Yeah. Food is a fascinating topic. I mean, first of all,
Mhm.
I just love food and
Yeah.
I want to talk about food and I want to eat food whenever I can. But it's also so fascinating. And you mentioned this earlier is, what I might call pone, for instance, is also called pone in several other Caribbean
Mm,
countries, but they make it slightly different.
yes.
Everybody has their unique spin on it, and every family has their unique spin on it.
Yeah.
And trying to understand why my poem might look different from somebody else's in another country
Hmm.
and understanding it through the lens of history and why historically theirs is a little bit different. You can trace all of this through history. When I look at social media, for example, people love to fight about the right way to make a specific dish. And I saw a woman on TikTok who she made pilau with lentils and not pigeon peas. And she got so much criticism from people and was having conversations with people in the comments about like, why do you dictate what my meal should be and what it looks like? And yes, I understand that pigeon peas is traditional in Trinidad for
Hmm.
pilau, but if I made it a little bit different, does that negate that it is in fact pilau? And I think these conversations are important conversations because to say that there is only one right way to cook a dish is putting blinders on be-
Exactly.
because how I make my dish is going to be different from how somebody in Jamaica makes it, but they
Hmm.
might still call it curry chicken.
Hmm.
It is still curry chicken. It's just a different version of curry chicken or chicken curry if you're in Guyana.
Yes. That's what I was going to say. Absolutely true. But, it's just one of those often discussions of how people make things, and as I said, I grew up listening to hearing people how they make it, and, "Oh, you use coconut milk? Okay, I use, something else," and it's just, whoa, and it's very intense, these conversations.
It is so intense, and people like to argue that
Yes.
their way is the best way,
Mhm.
and listen, we like to as Caribbean people, we like to argue, right? We like to fuss, we like to
Yeah.
have these conversations, and I think it's okay to have these conversation in jest, but once
Yes.
you start to make it super serious and you say, "My country does this the
Mhm.
best way," I think that's where we need to remember that we are more alike than we are different,
Exactly.
and it's okay to cook your food slightly different, but it doesn't mean you're any better or any worse than somebody else because your pilau has lentils versus pigeon peas.
Exactly. 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 And I know that we did talk about in terms of podcasting, it takes time and dedication. For you, what continues to motivate you to keep going and building on this platform?
That's a really that's a really great question, and it's an interesting one because, I talked about my reason for starting this podcast, and podcasts I've only been doing this for a couple of years. I'm just ending my, season 3. You've been
Mhm.
doing it longer than I have, so you know this better than I do, is it takes a while to get off the ground and
Yeah.
to gain a listenership. And so the perseverance in season 1 and then moving into season 2, sort of changing up the format a little bit, was sometimes a little bit hard to stay focused and hard to continue on
Mhm.
because the numbers and the listenership wasn't fantastic. But as I continued to pursue it, because I am really interested in sharing the stories of people, sharing our history, and also taking some of the academic work that wouldn't hit the mainstream and having people take their academic paper and talk about it on the podcast and reaching a new audience. To
Yeah.
me, all of that is very valuable. But
Mhm.
why do I keep going is I get comments from people saying things like, "Oh, I didn't know that. I learned something new." Thank you for sharing. And even the comments that I get specifically on social media of people saying that guest doesn't know what they're talking about,
Yeah.
or they're wrong, or whatever criticism. I can see in the criticism where people have blinders on and they're
Mm.
not open to real history.
Mhm.
They're stuck in their family stories.
Yes.
All of these positive comments and negative comments and feedback make me realize that information sharing is necessary to have people to maybe crack through some of those family stories and family beliefs and maybe place a nugget of something else in their brain for them to think about. And maybe people are open to learning something new and maybe they're not. But outside of the diaspora, I also love that I'm reaching all of these people who think about the Caribbean just as a vacation spot and just go to a resort and they meet the people that live in the resort and they think that's life in Jamaica or in Antigua, and opening their eyes to what is beyond the resort,
Mhm.
opening their eyes to maybe wanting to learn more about the people of these countries that they go to for 2 weeks or 1 week at a time.
No, absolutely, because when you can make a connection to somebody, whether it's positive or negative, it's a fact that you've made a connection and you've triggered something in them to make a comment, to write it, and to feel either moved, whether it's positive or negative. To invoke that is unbelievable, right?
Yeah. I mean,
And then
I'm sure you get both positive and negative
mhm,
comments as well. And in order to leave a comment, you have had to watch a clip or listen to the podcast. And I've reached you. And certainly we know on social media people are more apt to leave a comment if they're have something negative to say or if they want
mm,
to dispute. And that's fine because you
mhm,
listened to what somebody had to say and you took the time to leave a comment. And maybe that will stay in your head and maybe it will encourage you to learn more or open up your viewpoint. Maybe it won't,
yeah.
but at least you heard that 30-second clip. It gave you something to think about.
Oh, absolutely. And then it has you thinking as to, wow, that was very triggering for that person. And you know that they had to be really triggered for them to write something. That's the thing to connect. They had to. And I look at both, whether it's positive or negative, I look at it as a positive, to be quite honest. I'm sure that's how you look at it as well, because that shows, as I said, it triggered something within them to be able to think about and to digest, and it didn't align with what they normally would think of this particular subject. So I guess that's the power of this platform as well.
It
And
is. I will say that it took a while for me to build up that thick skin and not let these negative comments really sort of sit with me and fester in my mind. And I will, and I have no problem deleting rude comments
yes.
and deleting things that come across as racist. I will leave some, but I don't allow people to bring hurtful and harmful commentary onto my platform because it is still my platform.
Mhm, mhm.
And I hear things like I did an episode of the podcast with the Repair Campaign. So the
Mm,
campaign manager from the Repair Campaign, and it's talking about reparations
yeah.
for slavery. His he is not Afro-Caribbean. His family is mixed, and he presents as a mixed background.
Mm,
And I had somebody comment that he was born and raised in Jamaica and still lives in Jamaica. And I had somebody comment that he, because he is not Afro-Caribbean, cannot speak on behalf of the formerly enslaved African people
mm,
because he's not Black. And And I look at some of these comments, and I left her comment because it's important for us to understand that it's okay to look like me and still be an advocate. And I
Yeah.
think it's actually important, very important for people who are in the diaspora or who live in the Caribbean, who are not Afro-Caribbean, to be an advocate because we are part of the culture. And just because it didn't happen to my ancestors, it doesn't mean I don't care about it. And so I hear some of these negative comments and I leave them because I want people to think about it. I want us to understand. Again, I'm going to say this over and over again. We are more alike than we are
Yes.
different.
No, absolutely. We definitely are. And we need those different perspectives as well. We just cannot be siloed and only a 45-degree angle of looking at a subject. We need to see the broad scope and the broad brush for that in order for change and movement moving forward to happen. We need that.
We absolutely do. We know that I spoke to Ryan,
Mhm.
who founded the Indo-Caribbean Canadian Association, and we had the conversation about the anti-Black racism within the Indo-Caribbean community that still exists in some people.
Mm.
And it's important that we have these conversations because if it exists, we need to bring it out into the open, and also not just bring it out into the open, but help people understand why that exists. And it's if you look through history, the
Mhm.
colonizers wanted the Afro-Caribbean and the Indo-Caribbean, or the Indian indentured servants and the enslaved Africans, to not like each other. They
Exactly.
they put that in place, and maybe in some families, they don't understand why that racism, that anti-Blackness,
Mhm.
or anti-Indo-Caribbean, why that exists, because it just is a way that their family is. But if we can help them put it into perspective and realize that we're perpetuating something that others put onto us, then maybe we can dispel some of that otherness.
Mhm. No, absolutely, because that's all part of the design. Because even when the Irish indentured came and they saw the closeness between the enslaved Africans and the Irish indentured and made a rule, made a law around it. So the more that we know, it only opens up our perspective and our understanding for these things. And, Hema, for someone that does feel disconnected from their history or their cultural identity, what message or advice would you share with them to help them begin the journey?
This is not just my perspective, but it's something I
Mhm.
hear from people and many of the guests is talk to your elders
Yes.
and actually spend time and dig in. Now, Wendy, I don't know about your family and your extended family. When
Mhm.
I say family, I mean like aunts and uncles who are not blood related but are part
Yes,
of the family.
exactly.
It's we tend to be a closed off kind of people.
Mhm.
To People don't like to, in my experience, Trinidadian, Caribbean people don't like to talk about feelings and don't like to talk about
Mm.
hard subjects. And it's really a lot of surface. But if you can engage an elder and spend time, and it's not one conversation, but it's many, and
Exactly.
get them to trust you and tell you some of the stories, you're going to learn more than you could from a book, an article, or even from my podcast. Because if they can give you the perspective of 30, 40, 50 years ago,
Mhm.
it's important that we hear what they have to say. We hear how they saw the world at that time,
Mhm.
because things were different 50 years ago. If you were living in some part of the Caribbean,
Yeah.
your life was different, your perspective was different. All of those biases from the colonizers was still so prevalent. It's If you can talk to so the answer to your question, that was a long-winded
Mhm.
answer. The
No.
answer to the answer to your question is talk to as many people as possible. If you can't talk to elders, that's okay. start to do some research and remember who is telling the story. Remember who is sharing the research. Look at who the story comes from, what their sources are, and what their motivation is. And that will also help you understand, is this something you want to absorb and take in? Or is this maybe something that you want to put aside for now and find stories told through the lens of a person from the Caribbean?
That's what you said is just very powerful because I know when I was starting with my research, reaching out, talking to people, not only just direct family members, but extended. And it does do something for someone that you would have the time to sit there, to listen to them. Even if you have like I had a pen and paper, I'll never forget this one family member. He was 97 when I met him. And I had my pen and paper. I couldn't even write because I was just in awe of being able to speak with someone who was 97 and quite frankly didn't even look like he was 97 and was able to tell these stories and not only tell the stories, but the fact that his whole body just seemed to be reactivated and his mind seemed to go back into a time like almost being transported. And you can just see that memory archive being opened up and being able to be feeling safe with you, as you said, create a safe space and to tell you what happened back in the day, so to speak. And you're just like, whoa, there's some power behind here of being able to speak with somebody and having them retell something that was a really good part of them or what their journey was coming to America or coming to Canada or going to the United Kingdom. That is what is connection for us all. And it doesn't matter the age, but but we need that. We need to know what that time was in order for that to be understood and to kind of put into context present day.
Yeah. It's such an important part of the story is looking at it through various lenses and
Hmm.
various time frames because we are, it's 2026
Yeah.
and different generations have different perspectives on things
Hmm.
and may carry the perspective of their family, they may not, but the perspective of our elders is important in
Yeah.
understanding the whole journey and why things are the way they are today.
Hmm.
And if we don't like the way things are today, but we can understand why they are, then we can help to make some changes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we're going to go back to food
Yeah.
because food, always, it does carry memory. As I say, it's that archival memory and history. How does cuisine play a role in preserving the Caribbean stories and, of course, passing them down across generations?
Food tells the story of our people,
Mm.
right? Every dish that we eat tells a story of our people, but you don't know that unless you think about it.
Mm.
You don't really understand that unless you think about it. But to put it into perspective, and my perspective is coming from a Trinidadian family
Yeah.
where we have a vast array of influences in Trinidad, but I grew up in an Indo-Caribbean family, and so most of my perspective in food comes from that Indo-Caribbean culture. And I was having a conversation with someone about food in Trinidad, and she brought up cornmeal porridge. And I said, I actually have never eaten cornmeal porridge. It's not something that I grew up with. And for her, she thought that that meant that I didn't have a connection to
Mm.
Caribbean and Trinidadian food. And I had to explain to her that that is more of an Afro-Caribbean influence than it is an Indo-Caribbean. And that explains why it wouldn't have been something that my family would have eaten.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that it doesn't have a place and it doesn't belong. I grew up in a family that has a very specific cultural background. I also grew up in a family where my parents came to Canada in the 70s and
Mhm.
they brought their food and their understanding of Trinidadian food from the 70s and the era, they don't necessarily cook or enjoy meals that have been changed and migrated and morphed
Exactly. Yeah.
as they have in the 2000s. So understanding that food tells the story, we don't experience that story and we haven't all eaten every single thing that exists in the Caribbean in every single dish.
Yeah.
But if you take the time to think about why certain things are on the plate, you can learn the stories of our people, of our ancestors. And it's okay if all you want to do is just enjoy the food. That's fine.
Hmm. Yeah.
That's quite all right. But if you're interested in understanding why you might have something called roti in
Mm.
Trinidad, but you also have something called roti in India, but they're so different.
Yes.
I can tell you why that is.
No, perfect. And, you know, Hema, as we come to a close on this podcast, although I think we could have continued talking for a couple more hours, but, what does it mean for you personally to tell Caribbean stories in this moment?
Again, putting on my Canadian perspective and putting on my lived experience is the real misunderstanding of who people from the Caribbean are and the history and the understanding of how many different cultures and countries touched the Caribbean to make it the culture that it is today. I come from, again, an Indo-Caribbean family that moved to Canada in the 70s. I was born and raised here. I also understand that for many Canadians, many North Americans, their only thought of Caribbean is, where am I going to go in the middle of winter for a sun and sand vacation? But if we can share some of that history and have the people who only think about the Caribbean as a vacation spot go on their next vacation and feel encouraged to talk to some of the people that either work in the resort or work outside of the resort and start to see them and learn their stories. That's really important, to see them as people. See them as people who live on that specific island or that specific country and have a whole rich life outside of what you're seeing in a resort. That's really important. Also, it's important for us to also recognize that I grew up in a specific environment,
Mhm.
understanding specific things about my culture, but you have a different perspective. And I can learn from you as much as you can learn from me
Mhm.
about being a part of the diaspora.
No, well said, well said. And that's what it's all about. It's of the exchange of memory, the exchange of ideas, and the exchange of seeing things from a different perspective. And as long as we can take what we can from it and grow and move forward, that's the only thing that we can only offer. But thank you so much for coming on to the podcast, spending your time to speak onto this. And as well, I'll make sure everything is in the show notes so people can further connect with your platform. So thank you again.
Thank you so much. I appreciate joining you. And I also appreciate the work that you're doing on your podcast and telling things from a perspective that's different than I do. I think all of it brings
Mhm.
value. And I think anybody doing this work, it's important. And I
Yes.
hope that we get more people doing it and also more
Mhm.
people listening.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.